Have you visited any websites lately? The answer is probably yes. And if you've visited websites lately, you've probably visited a website that was built with React. React is one of the most popular libraries for building user interfaces, and companies like Twitter, Netflix, Airbnb, and PayPal use it to power their front-end experiences. My name is Eve Port. React is really awesome, and having a good command of the fundamentals will help you build projects of all sizes. In this course, we're going to get hands-on experience with React's core concepts, and we'll also explore concepts like testing, data fetching, and routing. This is going to be really fun. So let's get into it and build some cool stuff together. This course is an introduction to React, but I'm going to assume that you might have some front-end skills already in place. React is built out of JavaScript, so it might be helpful to know a bit of JavaScript. If you aren't familiar with JavaScript, I recommend JavaScript Essential Training with Morten Rand Hendrickson. This course will also use some of the latest JavaScript syntax. You'll pick that up in Morten's JavaScript class, but my course, Learning ECMAScript 6, could be a good supplement. That's really about it. We're going to be starting from scratch, so you should have everything you need to get started learning React. React is a JavaScript library that you can use to create user interfaces. It was created at Facebook and open sourced in March of 2013. Since then, React has expanded beyond the web with React Native, a tool that allows you to create native mobile applications using React. One of the best resources that you have at your disposal when learning React is the React docs. These are updated on a really regular basis and are very well written. You can also follow along with the React blog for articles on the team's new releases and future plans. React is an increasingly popular library with tens of thousands of stars on GitHub and use in production by huge companies like Twitter, Netflix, and Microsoft. But the point of using React is not just because it's popular, but because it's fun to use and because its component architecture makes it faster and easier to build amazing products for the web and even for native platforms. To get ready to work on React projects, a great place to start is to install the React Developer Tools. So if you're using the Chrome browser, we're going to navigate to the Chrome Web Store. We're just going to search for something like React Developer Tools. This will bring this up. And then I can add this extension to my browser. There's a button that you'll see that reads Add to Chrome. You will agree to add this extension. And then this is going to add this basically as a new tab to your browser. So check this out. If we take a look at a site that uses React, something like Airbnb.com, so you can open up your developer tools by hitting Command-Option-J or Control-Shift-J if you're using a PC. And then you're going to see a new Components tab that's been added. So this is letting you know all of the different components that are on the page. So these components are what make up Airbnb. Now, when we work on our own projects, we'll be able to see all of the components that we've created. What we want to do also, there's a quick configuration thing we want to do here. If you go to Chrome://extensions, this will give you a list of all of the Chrome extensions that you have installed. Now, click on the details next to the React Developer Tools, and we want to allow access to file URLs. This is going to allow us to use the React Developer Tools anytime we're running our projects locally, anytime we're trying to use files that come from our exercise files folder. So just make sure to have that so that when we try to inspect our React pages, everything will work as expected. If you're using Firefox, I have good news for you. You can also install the React Developer Tools using Firefox. So what we'll do is we will search for this. We'll search for React Dev Tools. If you look at addons.mozilla.org, you can find this extension. We will click Add to Firefox. We will click Add. And now our React Developer Tools have been added here. What this means is that anytime you're on a site that uses React, something like the beta React docs, for example, you can open up your developer tools. So let's right click and we'll click Inspect. This will open up all of the dev tools. And now we have this cool components tab that's going to give us all of the information about everything that's on this page. As we move through the content, we'll have some more time to look at how these work, but for now, we should just know that we'll be able to inspect sites and projects that use React. When you're working on a React project, it's a good idea to have some sort of place to write your code. One of the tools we can use to write code is Visual Studio Code. So this is totally free. If you don't have this installed already, it's one I would recommend. You can always download it from the website. If you're using a PC, it will prompt you to download it for a PC. If you're using a Mac, you can download it here. So we're going to go through the steps of installing VS Code. It'll download this to a zip folder. Nice. So once that's downloaded, we can click on it to expand the zip. Then we're going to see this here in our downloads folder, and we can go ahead and open it up. Once you open this, you're going to be able to open up your exercise files here. So again, you have access to the exercise files from this class. One of the easiest ways of getting started, I feel like, is to drag your exercise files folder over the Visual Studio Code editor. And then you're going to have access to all of them here, which is pretty cool. Another thing to do once you install VS Code for the first time is to go up here to the code menu, check preferences. And one of the things that people always ask me about my code editor is, it's the most important thing, right? What color theme are you using? So you can find different color themes if you go to preferences and then you select color theme. Here you see a whole list of them that you can choose from. So whatever feels right to you, you can pick. The one I'll be using for this class is called Night Owl. And if you don't already have Night Owl installed, you can go to Preferences, you can go then to Extensions, and then you can search for Night Owl in your extensions, and then you can click Install. Obviously, if you prefer to use a different theme or a different code editor entirely, that's totally great, and I encourage you to do so. Another thing I want to point out is if you go to your browser and you type react.new, into that new tab, React.new will give you a code sandbox that you can work with. So think of code sandbox as being like VS Code in the browser. You can use it for free, develop your own apps. Notice that you need to sign in. So you would sign in either with your GitHub account or with your Google account. But once you do that, you're going to have everything you need to get started on a project. So don't feel like you have to run anything locally using VS Code. You can always go to react.new in the browser, fire up a code sandbox, and get started that way. And then there are other tools for this type of thing too. If you want to check out CodePen, this is a really nice one as well. CodePen allows you to build, test, and discover front-end code, as their tagline suggests. There's also an app called Glitch, which I would recommend too. So lots of different ways to get started, but the important part is that we have some sort of location where we can write this front-end code. Right now we're using the react.dom.render function to take this create element call that we've added here on line 19 and add it to the document at the element called root. So we're saying find that element on the page and then inject our React code into it. Anytime we're writing code with React, we want to think about these elements as being these little bits of UI that we can render at any moment. So what I want to do is I actually want to create this as a variable. So instead of having all of these functions inside of another function, let's go ahead and cut this whole part here and paste it. And then what we'll do here on line 24 is we'll add heading. And this should work the same way. Now let's change this. Getting started with React, we'll add a couple exclamation marks, keep us honest, make sure that this is working, and it is. So this has allowed us to create a React element using its own separate variable. Now that we have VS Code installed or we have Code Sandbox running in the browser, it's time to get started with our React project. So I'm going to go ahead and drag my exercise files folder over the VS Code icon down here in my doc. This is going to help me find my start file. So we're in 0201 start, and we have here an index.html file. So let's see what we have here. Inside of our index.html file, we have in our head tag of this document, a couple different script tags. So I took the first step here of adding some links to the CDN of React. CDN stands for Content Delivery Network. Think of this link as being a way to quickly add the React library to your page in the browser. If you highlight this and you copy and paste it into Chrome, you'll notice that this is giving you the entire React library. So we're just going to reference this when we're writing our code. So we have here React, which is everything we need to get started with React. And then we also have React DOM. So React DOM is everything we need to actually add this React to the page. Think of this link as being a quick way to add the React library to your page in the browser so that all of the functions and features you might need from React are preloaded. Once you add this to the page, you can start to create your first element using React. So one of the quickest ways of getting this file open in the browser is I'm going to minimize this a little bit. Then I'm going to drag this index.html. I'm going to use this to add a new tab. It's asking me if I will allow this, and I totally will allow this. So now what I can do is put both of these on the same screen. Perfect. The way that React works is that instead of creating these elements on the HTML page using HTML, we're going to instead create them using React, using JavaScript. So what I'll do is here in the body, I'm going to create a div. And this div will have an ID of root. More often than not, when you're working on a React project, the place where we're going to add our React code is to a div that has this ID. Now, the next thing I'll do is I'll add to this page a script tag, and we're going to say type text/JavaScript. And then here I'm going to type React DOM.render. Now, React DOM.render is one of the most important functions in the React DOM library. It's going to take in two different arguments. The first of the arguments that we'll send to this function is react.createElement, and we're going to use this to create an element to add to the page. Instead of using this h1 here, I want to create the same thing using React. So we'll say h1 is the type of element I want to create. Null is the second argument that we'll pass here because we don't want to pass any properties to this element. And then finally, we want to mimic this h1 fully by writing getting started with React. Perfect. So now check this out. This is our first argument that we're going to send. We're going to follow that with a comma, and then we'll say document.getElementById root. So to React DOM.render, we're sending two things. The first is the element we want to create. The second is where we want to put this. So we're saying take this element and put it right here inside of this div. So we're going to give that a save. We also need to refresh our page over here, and we'll notice that we're getting two different outputs here. The first is our h1 that we've created with HTML, the second with React. So I'm just going to get rid of our h1. We'll give that another save. So we did it. We've created our first element using React. The first thing I want to do here is change our heading to an unordered list. So we're going to make this a UL, a bullet list. And now how would I add different child elements like list items to this? Well, all I need to do for this third argument that we send to react.createElement, remember, this is what we want to create. This is any properties that we want to send. So for example, I could say like style, color, blue, and then this should make it that color. Let's add our child elements first. We'll say list item, null, and Monday here. And now we should see this style has been applied, number one. So our properties have been injected, but we also have this create element call creating a list item. What is a list? If it only has one item, we can add to it Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and now we have all of these being rendered. As our user interface becomes more complex, as we have more create element calls on the page, our code starts to get a little hectic. And by that, I just mean that every single element that I would need to create has to have its own create element call. So what we want is some sort of a helper, some sort of a syntax to come fix this for us, and that helper is called JSX. JSX, or JavaScript as XML, is an HTML-like syntax for creating UI elements. So instead of having to use all of these create element calls, and I'm going to replace the UL here to make this work, we're going to just use tags. So this looks a whole lot like HTML. We're going to go ahead and create a little emoji list here. How about that? So we'll say Control Command Space. We will select a robot. That's one. We'll add another list item. Control Command Space, cowboy. We'll say moon. How about that smiley moon? Perfect. So now we're doing the exact same thing that we did here, but this time with tags. Now, the only problem with this is if I try to run this, we're going to see that there's an unexpected token. As soon as we hit this line 20, where we're asking React to render a JSX tag, we see a problem. In the next video, we're going to fix this problem using Babel. A quick thing to mention as we're working with these HTML files is anytime you are trying to swap between different files, you can do this up in your search bar here, and you can replace 0203 with 0204. So now, even though we are at our new video here, we're in our new file, we're still seeing this unexpected token error. So the reason that we're seeing this is because JSX, this tag-based syntax, is not supported in the browser. So what we actually have to do here is we have to take this code, and I'm going to copy this for the sake of demo. We need to use some sort of tool as a compiler. Now, if you go to babeljs.io and you click on try it out, this will be an interface that you can use to take some code that you've written. You can see what it looks like after Babel has been used. So we're seeing that our unordered list with all these different list items is generating all of these create element calls. When we use a tool like Babel, it's going to take this code that's not supported by the browser and turn it into code that is, so that we don't have to write all of this code that is hard to read. It's sort of hard to write. There's a lot of opportunities for things to go wrong. Instead, we're going to write it like this using this awesome tag-based syntax, and all of this compilation will happen so that it works in the browser. The fastest way to get started with this is to use another one of these CDN links, and I'm going to add this here. If you want to grab the link, you can always grab it from the finished file. But we're going to find this at unpackage.com/babel-standalone at 6/babel.min.js. .min just means that it's been minified for the browser so that it will work a little bit more quickly. And then the other thing that we need to do, we're still noticing, if I refresh this, that we have that syntax error. The thing we need to do to fix this is, instead of using text JavaScript, we need to use text/Babel. Babel is going to go through any of the script tags that have text Babel, and it's going to transform any of these tags that don't work in the browser to those create element calls that do. Something we're seeing here in our console is that it says you're using the in-browser Babel transformer. Be sure to compile your scripts for production. So this is not the most optimized way of working with Babel, but it's going to get us started quickly by just using this to transform this in the browser. Later in the course, we'll be using other tools that are going to handle all of this before the code even gets to the browser. So that's Babel. In addition to being used for JSX, it's also used for the most modern JavaScript syntax so that we don't have to wait to use these awesome new features. We can use them right away. As you work with React and JSX together, you'll start to notice how powerful JSX actually is. We can use it to inject dynamic content into our tags simply by referencing them by variable name. So what do I mean by that? Let me show you. The first thing I'll do is I'm going to create a variable called robot, and I'm going to set this equal to our robot here. Then I'm going to create another one for a cowboy. And we want to make sure that those are always being passed in strings. And then we'll grab the moon as well. So let moon equal our nice little smiling moon friend. So inside of our list now, I want to take whatever this value is, and I want to display it inside of our list item. So we'll go ahead and use the curly braces. Anytime we're using a curly brace in JSX, we're using a JSX expression. So here we'll pass robot, cowboy, and moon. So now nothing has really changed about our output. So let's add another list item here. And what I want to add is, we'll say let name equal React. We're going to plug in the name here, and we should see React being added to our list items. Now, remember, anytime you see a JSX expression with the curly braces, you can use all sorts of functions inside of these braces. So let's say I said to uppercase, and we called that function, and now this is going to transform React into all caps. Similarly, we could say name.length. That'll give us the property that we've asked for. So JSX is a really powerful way that we can inject dynamic content into our apps. Now that we have an understanding of how to create elements, we want to create our first component. Think of a component like being a little building block. It's a piece of the user interface that we'll use to describe one part of our application. What we can do first is get rid of our emoji helpers here. And then we're going to get rid of our unordered list as well. So at this point, we're going to create our first component as a function. A component is just a JavaScript function that returns JSX. So if we added this here, we could say header, and then inside of our H1, we could say Eve's kitchen. So now, once we've created our header, we want to render the header using the react.dom.render function. Now with JSX, we can, in addition to creating these HTML elements, we can also render components. So anytime we're creating a component, a couple of things to think about. We want to use a capital letter, and we also want to create this as a function. So let's refresh, and we should see Eve's kitchen being added to our page. Pretty cool. Now, the next thing we want to do here is let's add another component. So we'll say function main, and here we'll return a section and another section, and we'll say P, we serve the most delicious food around. So now that we've created our main component, we can render this one too. So we serve the most delicious food around has been added to our page. Now, something else I want to show you here is that sometimes we want to add a couple different components to the page. It can feel tempting to do something like this, where we're adding a header and main side by side. And what we'll notice right away is that we can't do it. We see an error popping up here. Let's zoom out a little bit. We'll see an error right here that says that adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. React always wants to render a single component. So we could wrap this in, say, a div, make this the parent of both of the header and the main, and now we can see that this has been added. But we also could do something like this. We might want to create a function called app, and the app is going to be responsible for rendering both the main component and the header. So that's going to look like this. We'll say div. We'll close that div, we will add a header, and we'll add a main. So instead of rendering our div here, let's render the app. And check it out, we got the same output. Nice. So again, a component is just a function that returns some JSX. It returns a bit of our user interface, and then we can use the react.dom.render function to render that component using this JSX syntax. In the previous video, we created some components. In this video, let's take a look at how we can use components to display dynamic data. Our restaurant is cool and everything, but do you really want to display my name? Of course not. No way. You probably want to display your own name. So let's go ahead and do that. To start, we're going to pass an object called props into our header function. Then, before our return statement, we're going to console log props to see what we get. So if we hit refresh and we open up our console, a couple ways to do that: Command Option J or Control Shift J on the PC, or you can right click, click Inspect, and then you'll get to the elements, and then you could go to the console. This is going to display an object. Right now, this object has nothing in it. To add values to this component, we'll need to add them wherever the component is being rendered. So right here on line 41 is where we would do that. We could say name equals, and then you can put your own name in here. Let's say your name is Cindy. Now, if we refresh, we should see an object with that name. Now, to access these values, we would just go ahead and grab them from the props object. So here we could use another one of these JSX expressions, and we'd say props.namesKitchen, and there we go. Cindy's kitchen is now being added. So let's go ahead and add a dynamic property to our main component. So the main component also has access to our props object. Right now we are displaying delicious food, but we can say props.adjective food. And now in the main component, we'll say adjective equals amazing. And now this should inject that right into that component. Let's also add a period there. All right, cool. Let's add one more property, and we're going to add that one more property to our new component, which we'll call footer. And the footer component is going to return a footer. So a footer tag. And within that footer tag, we want to use another type here. So we'll say p copyright props.year. Now what we can do, if we scroll down a little bit further, is we can render our footer inside of our app component. And so far we've just used strings. So far we've used strings as properties. Let's say we wanted to use a number. We would need to wrap this in a set of curly braces. So let's go ahead and refresh that, and we'll see that added here. You also could make this a little more dynamic by adding a function. You could use something like new date.get full year. And this will just add whatever the current year is. Pretty cool. So we want to think about the props object as being this little container where you can place information in for any component. When we render the component, we'll pass the properties into the component. And then within that component, we'll reference them in the props object with dot notation. So far, we've passed properties into components in a few different ways. We've used strings like Cindy and amazing. We used this little date function. We also saw how we used a number. You could pass true or false. All of these are going to be passed via these JSX expressions. Only strings are going to be wrapped in quotes. But what happens if we have a different data type, something a little bit more complex like an array? Well, let's go ahead and create an array and try it out. So first things first, we're going to, on line 46 here, create a list of dishes at our restaurant. So we could add black bean soup. We could add macaroni and cheese. And then we could add salmon and potatoes. Perfect. Remember, this is your restaurant, so obviously put your own favorite foods on your own list. Don't let me tell you how to run your restaurant here. Now, if we wanted to display this list inside of our main component, we would need to map over it. So let's go ahead and collapse our footer here. And then we're going to, inside of this section, let's go ahead and replace our paragraph with an unordered list. We're going to say that this UL should, inside of this, we're going to map over the dishes. So we'll say dishes.map. Then for each dish, we want to return a list item. And this list item should look like this. in it, we should add a dish. So let's see what we get. At the moment, dishes is just referencing this global variable called const dishes, so we can still render all of these values. Now, I actually want to access these values via props though, right? So it's going to be up to me to pass these dishes in this way. So we'll say dishes equals dishes. Now this property we can reference off of props.dishes, and we should see the same output. So this is working as we expect. Hiding inside of our console here, we have a warning. So it says each child in a list should have a unique key property. So in the next video, we're going to fix this. In the previous video, we rendered a list of menu items dynamically. So if we added another item to our list, say pizza, we would see that this is dynamically added anytime we hit refresh over here. We also noticed that there was a warning that was popping up in our console, letting us know that every child in a list had to have a unique key property. So the reason that this appears is that it's possible that things might get out of sync when rendering occurs, particularly if something is added to the front of that list or somewhere in the middle. Think of a key as being like an ID that keeps everything in sync. And it's JavaScript, right? So of course, there are a couple of ways of handling this. First, we could just add an index. So here, when we're iterating over our dishes array, we could add I as an iterator, and then we can add a key of I to each one of our dishes, and that will clear the warning. The React docs do recommend against this though, because there still can be problems with rendering, which is kind of not the point of keys in the first place. So something we could do is perform a little data transformation, which we'll do here on line 53. So we're going to go ahead and create an array of objects. So we'll call this dish objects, and we'll set that equal to dishes.map. For each item in our dishes array, we want to create an object. And the reason for that is because each one of these should have an ID. So we'll say ID is I, and then the title is dish. So whatever the value of this dish is. Now, something to point out here is that whenever we are returning an object from an arrow function, we need to point that arrow function at a set of parentheses instead of just pointing it directly at these curly braces. So let's give it a save. This should create these objects. We're going to see though that nothing much changes because we need to add dish objects as our value for dishes. As soon as I do that, I have exploded my app, which is okay. And that's because it's finding an object with a couple of keys instead of flat values. So let's scroll up a little bit further. We're still using dishes, but now what we want to do is this. We'll say dish.title. We'll remove this key here, and then we'll say dish.id. So you might be thinking, isn't this the same because we're just using an index again? Not really, because the data is actually stable. We've created it using this function instead of being created while the list items are being rendered. Another thing to think about is that your data already might look like this. So you could just use an ID or another unique field if you are already dealing with an array of objects. Keys help keep your data in sync as your application state changes over time. So this is why it's really important to add them anytime you're trying to iterate over something and return a dynamic value. In an earlier video, we saw how it was important to wrap any sibling components inside of a div because we saw that error saying that adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. So we're seeing how React only wants to render that single component. But we're seeing here how adding a div, if we're constantly adding wrappers to the page, this can start to junk up our element tree. We're seeing there's a div here with root and then another div, and then we start to get to the actual components that are on the page. Now, something to keep in mind is that instead of using a div, you can use what's called a React fragment. We can add this by using react.fragment. We can see that our div root is wrapping directly around the header, the section, and the footer that we've created with these components. It's also possible to use an even shorter syntax for this, but we have to make sure that we're using specific versions of React. So for now, we're going to keep react.fragment, but later I'll show you how to remove react.fragment and just use this really shorthand syntax. But for now, just know that react.fragment will not add anything to the DOM, but it will allow you to render these sibling components with ease. Now that we know how to add text to our React application, let's go ahead and add an image. So let's go ahead and do that here. We're going to open up a website called pexels.com. This is a free stock photo website. We're going to find some sort of restaurant image to put on our page. So choose whatever one of these feels right to you. I'm going to just click on the first one here, and we're going to right click on this, and we're going to select copy image address. Now, within our component, so here in, say, our main component, let's go ahead before the unordered list, we're going to add an image tag, and to it, we're going to add a source, which will be whatever this image URL is. Now, if I refresh, I should see this image being added. A couple things to think about here. Number one, this image is really big. So let's give it a height of 200, which will be 200 pixels. Now, if I refresh, it should fit a little bit nicer. We want to make sure to add an alt attribute to this image, or indeed any image that we're adding. So this alt is going to just describe what is inside of this image to make this more accessible. So if someone is using a screen reader or other type of assistive technology, they'll be able to hear what is in this image. And so we'll say a server presents 2 plates at a fancy restaurant. Perfect. So you can describe that however you see fit, but having alt text is really important. So another thing that we can do is let's go ahead and right click on this. We'll say save image as, and we're going to just download this to our computer somewhere. We'll just call it restaurant. Now that I have this and it's downloading here, we're going to open up our files. So you can always hit Command B, and that's going to toggle open and close your exercise files. Let's go ahead and drag this to the start folder. And we can grab this, we can access this locally instead of hitting this URL here. So here we'll just say /restaurant.jpg, whatever the name of the file is, and whatever its location is. So you can just save that locally if you'd prefer to go that route. So these are 2 different ways of incorporating an image. We have a source attribute that can be set either equal to the file inside of this folder, or we can use the URL and present the image that way. So far, we've used an index.html file to house our React components and run them locally in the browser. This can take us pretty far, but now I want to demonstrate a project that uses a tool called Create React App so that we can take it from prototype to production successfully. So what we want to do in our terminal is we want to make sure that we're navigated to the right folder. We're doing that again. And we're going to type cd. We will drag our start folder from 0401 over here. And now we are navigated to the right spot. The other thing we want to have is we want to make sure that Node.js is installed. So make sure that you have some version of Node installed. If you don't, go ahead in your browser to nodejs.org. And from here, you're just going to download this and install it. So this tool that we're going to use is called Create React App. Think of Create React App as being a way to generate a React project from scratch and to set up things like Babel, file bundling, and all sorts of different things right here in your project. Once you have Node installed, which you'll know by running node-v and seeing some sort of a version number, your version number doesn't have to be exactly what I have. We also want to check which version of NPM we're using. So npm-v will let us know we're using version 8. As long as you see something higher than 5.2, you'll be able to do the next command, which is to run npx create-react-app. and then whatever you want to call this project. So we'll just call the project React app. And this is going to generate this in this folder. Now, installing all of this might take a few minutes, but it's going to install React, React DOM, and something called React scripts. Think of React scripts as being all of the Babel, all of the compiling, all of that will be set up for you from scratch. Okay, next thing we want to do here is we want to make sure that we're in the correct folder, which we'll do by typing cd react-app. That'll move us into that directory. And now we can run npm start. This will pop open a browser window, or you can open a browser window to localhost 3000. And this is going to be the starting point for building our app that's going to run locally. So we have everything we need now to get started. Now that we have our project generated inside of this start folder, React app, inside of the package.json, you can see all of the different dependencies that are part of the project. The main ones we should know about are React and React DOM. So React is everything we need to actually create our React components. React DOM is how we add them to the page. And React scripts is how we handle all of our bundling. You'll also notice in the dependencies section that we have some testing libraries, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The main files that are part of our app are here in the source folder. So the source folder contains the index.js. Think of this as being kind of like the entry point to your application. It's the main JavaScript file that we can use to render our app right here to our DOM. Notice too that we're using document.getElementById. This is referencing the root element inside of this public folder. There's an index.html, much like the one that we worked with before, where we're going to inject all of our React code. Now let's collapse this public folder again, and we're going to go back to the index file. Something to note is that we have the app wrapped with this other component called react.strictMode. So think of strict mode as being a tool for highlighting any potential problems in your app. It's just a package that's going to activate some additional checks to let you know if you've written any code incorrectly, but these are only going to run in development. They're not going to run in production. So the app component that we have here, if we go to the app.js file, typically our components will be kept inside of their own files. Notice here that this is a function that we're creating. And then at the bottom of this, we're exporting this as the default export of this app.js file. So this is really everything we need. Now, something that we want to do is make sure that we're navigated to the React app. So we'll drag this over. We're going to run npm start. Again, this will run this project on localhost 3000. And then any of the changes that I make to this app are going to be reflected right away. So unlike before, when we were using our HTML file, we can just make some changes. So we could say hello from React. I'm going to get rid of the logo that we used to import. Now we don't import it anymore. And now we have hello from React being rendered. So automatically, Create React App is going to be responsible for anytime I hit save, it's going to refresh my browser for me. So this is super useful as I'm developing my own projects. You'll also notice in this folder, we have a CSS file that's being imported. Any sort of changes that we made to this, let's say for this div with the class name of app, I changed the background color to red. Now that looks pretty bad, but it works, right? We're picking up that style directly from the file. So anytime you want to import, you can do so. Because I have Create React App set up, then we're going to automatically import this and then apply the class name as you see fit. Let's go back here and remove that though for now. Something I just want to mention too that's related to our exercise files is if you take a look at your exercise files folders, you'll see in the finished or in the start folder, you'll see our project here called React App. So if we were to navigate to this folder and run npm start, you might notice that it says React scripts command not found. And this is because all of the dependencies for the project haven't been installed. Now, inside of our package.json file, this is going to show all of the different packages that you would need to install for this project. So if I run npm install or npm I, this is going to install all of the dependencies. You'll notice that there's a node modules folder here where all of those will go. And then you can run npm start again. If you do run into that problem, it's not a problem. Just run npm install and then go ahead and run npm start and you should be good to go. So now that we have everything set up, let's go ahead and set out to build our first React app. A really important JavaScript concept that we want to know about is destructuring. So this is going to help us get ready to deal with state in our application. Now, we saw how passing properties to any component, we would just do so wherever the component was rendered. On line 9 here, we could add a property called library. We could set this to, say, React. Now, if we go back to our app.js file, instead of just hard coding this, we're going to grab this from our props object. So we could say props.library, and then we should see this being rendered here in our browser. So let's make sure that this is working. We'll say GraphQL, and this should re-render that. Now, something that's important to do here is let's go back to our app.js, is we can use destructuring to actually grab properties from this props object by their key. So think of the object as having a key called library, a value called React. Now what I can do here is I can say, let's just select the library key. And now I don't have to access this via props.library. Instead, I can just grab it on library. So again, we can just grab that directly from that object. This is a pattern called destructuring. We're destructuring an object, we're reaching in and grabbing it by its key. We can also destructure arrays. So for example, let's go ahead and we're going to create an array of cities. And this array of cities will have a few different values in it. And we'll also add Bend here. Now, if I wanted to grab a city from this array, I could say cities 0 and grab the first of these. So let's go back to our browser and we should see this popping up here. We see Tokyo. Let's also get these side by side. Now we have it together. Okay, so now this is going to help us access this value. Now, unlike our destructuring of the object, we can't reach into the cities array and assign some sort of a property name based on a key. Instead, what we would need to do is we would need to use a pattern called array destructuring. We're going to replace cities with a set of square braces, and then we're going to say first city, and then now we will console log first city. And this will give us Tokyo. So now what we've done with array destructuring is we've given this value a name. We could also say second. We're going to see Tahoe City being added here. So what we're doing with array destructuring is we are assigning a variable name based on a position in the array. This is going to be vitally important to us in the next lesson. Managing state in a React application is really important, and the most modern way to handle state variables in an app is to use a function called useState. Let's take a look. So the first thing that we want to do here is we want to import from React a function called useState. And then we're also going to get rid of our destructured array from before. Those skills will come into play in 1 second here. But what we actually want to do here is we want to, on line 5, use this value called what. And we're using the what value to figure out what does useState return. When I call this state function, what is actually being returned? So what we see here, if we hit refresh to clear out those older logs, we see an array. This array has 2 values. The first is an undefined value, and then the second is a function. So we want to think about this undefined value as being the state value currently when we run the app for the first time, when we render our app component. The second value here is a function that we're going to use to update the state. So how do I set an initial state for this app? Well, I'm going to set it by passing a value to this useState function. Check it out. The first value now is happy. Now, how do I assign some sort of a name to this value? We know from before that we can use array destructuring to do just this. So what we're going to do here on line 5 is we'll create a value for a state called emotion. Then we're going to create an updating function called setEmotion. Now, when my app first renders, the state will be happy. So within our H1 here, let's go ahead and change this to read current emotion is emotion. So there we go. Our current emotion, our emotion as soon as we run this is happy. Let's also get rid of this library from before. We want to keep our code clean. So let's go ahead and fix that. Now we've created our emotion value. The second thing we want to do is call this setEmotion function to change the state. We need to have this respond to some sort of user input. So I'm going to call this button sad. We're going to hit the sad button. So now I'm going to add to this an onClick method so I can change the emotion to sad. So here we're going to use this function to call setEmotion. And setEmotion will take in the new emotion, which is sad. So check this out. As soon as I click sad, the current emotion will be, you guessed it, sad. Emotion is our state variable. setEmotion is the function that we're going to use to update the state. Remember that you can use this for all sorts of new emotions if you wanted to. Let's say excited. We'll set the emotion to excited. And now when I click the excited button, the current emotion is excited. So a state variable can be a string, it can be a Boolean, it can be an object, it can be an array. But the important thing to know is that when we pass in its initial value, this is the value when our app is actually rendered to the page for the first time. And then anytime I call setEmotion, I'll do so with a new state, and that will change the state for the entire app. Another important hook that's part of the React library is useEffect. useEffect is another one of these hooks that is built into React, and this one can feel a little bit tricky because it's typically used to manage side effects that aren't related to a component's render. Things like console messages, loading data, and working with animations can often benefit from useEffect. So let's take a basic look at useEffect with a console log. So the first thing we want to do, we'll import useEffect from React. And then we're going to use inside of our app component this useEffect hook. Now this time, instead of setting this equal to some sort of array, we're going to pass in a function to this. So we'll go ahead and say console log, it's emotion right now. So now we'll see that this will log this message to our console. We think about this as being a side effect. It's not necessarily going to be affected by the render, but instead it's going to be something that just happens alongside the render. Now, something else to note here is useEffect actually takes in 2 arguments. The first is this function that's going to be called whenever we want our effect to happen, but the second has to do with when the effect is actually being called. We're going to pass into this an empty array. If you pass in an empty array, this means that the effect is not going to be called again after the first render. So it's only going to be called once as soon as the component renders, but not as we change this emotion. We call this array the dependency array because we can use it to define when this should be called. Should it just be called once when our component first renders? Or another option is we could pass in a property, a state value, to listen for any changes in this array. So check this out. If I refresh, it's happy right now. If I click it again, excited, sad. Anytime this emotion changes, we're going to see this useEffect fire. Now, in the next video, we'll do some more tweaks with this to really get an understanding of how this dependency array actually works. It's also possible to use our useEffect calls and our useState calls to keep track of different variables. So let's go ahead and create another one of these. We're going to call this secondary and set secondary, meaning emotion. And then we're going to say useState, and our initial state is tired. It's very possible to be happy and tired all at once. I always am. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add another button that's going to trigger this change. So set emotion. Let's go ahead and put one next door. We'll say H2 current secondary emotion is secondary. And now we'll say grateful. So now we're going to add an onClick. Remember that this should trigger this change, set secondary. And we'll go ahead and trigger that here. We'll say set secondary and pass in a new emotion, which will be grateful. Perfect. So now this should work. Now, this is great for handling different emotions, but we also want to make use of our useEffect here. The point that I'm getting to, I swear I have a point, is to make sure that we're keeping track of these emotions, and we're making sure to trigger these emotional changes when appropriate. So check this out. We'll say useEffect. We'll pass in our helper function or callback function here. We'll say console log. And we'll say it's secondary around here. Now, if I don't pass in that dependency array, we're going to notice that as soon as I start to make these changes, trigger these emotions, we're going to get it's tired around here for every single one. If we pass in that empty array, remember this will just call this useEffect when our component first renders. So no matter how many emotions I change, we won't see it's tired again. Now, if we were to say secondary here, this is going to call that anytime that emotion changes. Now, something else to keep in mind is you could pass more than one of these into the dependency array. You could pass more than one of these state variables if you wanted to. So let's say you wanted to, anytime the secondary emotion changed and the initial emotion changed, we want to call this function. Well, we can do it. We could say sad, excited, and then if I say grateful, then we're going to see both of these actually rendering. So the dependency array, very important. Make sure that you don't forget to include it when you're calling useEffect. The next thing I want to do here is let's create a checkbox that's going to manage state with useState. So we'll get rid of our useEffect call here. We will get rid of all of our state management stuff. Then we're going to, within our return statement, we're going to, inside of this div, add an input. The input is going to have a type of checkbox. And so we should see that there. Let's also display a label. And for now, we'll just have it say checked. Okay, so we'll zoom way in on that for now. And what we want to do is create a checked variable. We'll say checked and set checked, and that should be set equal to useState, and the initial state is false. We're going to use this checked value to manage the state of the checkbox. So we want to use value here. And now every time I change the status, I want this to change the output. So we're going to call onChange. We will call set checked. And then we'll take a look at whatever the value of checked is, and we will return the opposite. So now we want to have our label reflect that change. So inside of the label, we'll check to see if checked is true. If so, we want it to read checked. Otherwise, we want it to read not checked. So on first render, checked is false. Now, if I toggle this, it should work. So this is a good way of being able to handle our checkbox using useState, but I want to update this a little bit because I think that this could be a little better. And by a little better, I mean, it would be cool if we could extract this functionality into a separate function so that we don't have to manage this inside of our onChange. So let's go ahead and change this. And the change we'll make is to use a different hook, function called useReducer. useReducer is going to take in two different arguments. The first is the function that we're going to use to update our state. So that's just going to be placed right here. And then the second argument is going to be our initial state. So let's go ahead and we'll save that. We will get our onChange under control. Now our onChange is going to take in the name of the function that we'll use to update the state. So we'll say set checked. We'll give that a save. Now we can see this a little bit better. Remember, the function that we use to update the state is here, and then the initial state is here. As far as our output goes, the output is going to be exactly the same, but what's nice is that we don't have all of that extra code being written in the onChange that could potentially lead to bugs, and this is going to ensure that anytime we call the setChecked function, the results are going to be the same. One of the most important things to think about when we're working on a React project is how are we going to handle form inputs? Right now we're dealing with this checkbox, which is a little toggle here, but let's say we wanted to collect some different information. So what I want to do here is I want to set this up. I want to get rid of useReducer. I want to instead incorporate another one of these hooks called useRef. A ref or a reference is a way that we can reach out to an individual element and check in with what its value is. So we're going to use this in our app, and we're going to create our first React form. In it, we'll have an input. This time it'll be type equals text, and we'll call this a placeholder. We'll say color title. And then the other type of input that we're going to use is a color input. So if you haven't worked with this one before, it's pretty cool. It's an input that's going to collect some sort of color value. So the other thing I need to add here is a button. The button will just say add, and we are going to, inside of this app function, create another function called submit. We're going to prevent the default behavior of the form with prevent default. So we'll prevent the page from refreshing here. Once I've created this submit function, we're going to, for the form, add a handler called onSubmit. And basically, anytime the form submits, we want to do whatever is part of this function. So here's where those refs come into play. I want to be able to reach out to this and grab the name of the color as well as the color itself. Now, the way that we'll do this is we're going to use text title. We'll set that equal to useRef. And then we'll say hex color. And we'll also set that equal to useRef. So what are these values? Let's take a look at it in the console. We should see an object here, and the object has this key on it called current. So think of the current as being whatever the value of this field might be at any given time. We're going to attach these references to these inputs. So the first ref will be called text title, and the second ref hex color. So now if I try that again, we should see the object again, and the current input has a value. So that's really what I'm curious about here. I want to reach out to figure out what the current value of the text field as well as our color. So we'll do that here. We're going to create a variable called title, which will set equal to whatever the text title current value is. Same with the color. So we'll say const color equals hex color dot current dot value. Then we're going to alert whatever these values are. So I'll just say title comma color. Perfect. So now if we say purple, we find purple here and we click add, we should see both the value as well as that color. Now, another little cleanup thing we might want to do is we can, once we click OK, we'll see that purple and the color purple are still here. So text title dot current dot value, as soon as I alert it, we want to set it back to an empty string. Same with hex color dot current dot value, we'll set that equal to an empty string. And now if we try that one more time with, say, yellow, we get the alert, we get those values, and then once we click OK, we'll get those cleared out. So think of useRef as being a hook that is going to reach out to some sort of UI element and get its value. The way that we're handling this form right now, we're creating what's called an uncontrolled component. So we're saying, create this little container, give us whatever that value is. And something to keep in mind is, unlike useState, where the component will re-render if there's some sort of a change, useRef is not going to re-render. We always are going to have to reach out to the current value, the current dot value, to figure out what that value actually is by reaching out to the input itself. It's also possible to manage forms using state. So this useRef, anytime we see useRef being used, we are creating what's called an uncontrolled component where we manage our form elements outside of state. But using state for this is a really good idea too. So the first thing we want to do is remove useRef and all references, no pun intended to that. Then we're going to update our app here to remove those. We'll also remove refs from both of our inputs. And finally, let's go ahead and remove those references to current.value. Next thing I want to do is we're going to create two different state variables, title, set title. Our initial state will be an empty string. We also want to create a color value. And the initial state here should be 0000000, which is black. Now, within our inputs, we're going to set the value to title. Same goes for our color input. We'll set that value to color. And then remember, we want to trigger some sort of onChange event. And this time we want to trigger some sort of onChange event for our inputs. That's going to look like this. We'll take in the event and we'll call set title with whatever the event target value is. So in other words, when I add something to this field, I want to be able to capture that on the target.value. We'll do the same for color, but here we're just going to say event set color event target value. Nice. So if we zoom out a little bit, we should see that both of these inputs now are handling our state, and each is associated with its own state variable. Now, the final thing I want to do here is let's go ahead and we'll keep this alert here, and let's try this. This should pop up, give us our color title and our color value. And then we also want to perform that cleanup with set title. We'll set it back to an empty string. And then set color, we'll set back to our initial state, which is black. So now, trying it again, let's say orange, and we'll get a beautiful orange color there. And now once we click OK, Both should be exited out. Whenever we see a state value being used with a form, we want to think about this as being a controlled component. Controlled meaning that we're controlling our form by creating state values for these form elements. We've seen how React hooks can add additional functionality to our applications. We can use the state hook to manage state of form fields. We can use ref to reach out to these inputs and figure out their values. And we've also used useEffect to perform side effects. Now, one of the most exciting things about working with hooks is that we can create our own custom hooks that can be used inside of our applications to handle all sorts of different things. So we want to think about our form here, right? We have a form element, and the form element has two different inputs. When I type into this input field, there's always going to be some sort of input. And then we also want to be able to clear out whatever I've typed into those inputs after I have submitted the form. So there's some kind of repeatable behavior going on here. And this is how we're going to think about it when we create our own custom hook. A custom hook is a function, and this function is going to always start with the keyword use. So this time for our useInput function, we want to take in some sort of initial value, and we want to, inside of this, use another one of these useState hooks. So any field, any input is going to take in a value, and we're also going to use the setValue function to update that value. And then finally, useState, when we call it, will take in some sort of initial value. So what we actually want to return, think of a hook. Remember, our useState hook returns a pair. useRef is going to return this object. Our hook, and again, this can return whatever you want, is going to return an array. The first item in the array is going to be the state value, as well as an onChange, which takes in whatever this input is and calls setValue with the event target value. So really similar to what we did with our controlled component. The second item that we're going to pass here is the cleanup function. We'll set the value to whatever that initial value is. All right, so we'll give that a save. And now within the form, we're going to use useInput. So instead of useState here, we're going to use useInput. Our initial value is going to be an empty string. And we're going to call this title props. So again, it's the value and the onChange. And then we'll also call this second item reset title. And this will be color props and reset color. And we'll keep our initial value as black here. So here we can do some pretty cool cleanup. So we could say title props dot value. So we want to figure out what that is. Color props dot value. And now we can call reset title. And we don't actually have to pass anything in here. So we're making this a little bit more reusable. All right, and finally, instead of having our onChange and our value passed in this way, what we're going to do instead is we're going to push in all of the values from title props. This is a syntax that we're using to basically spread all of the properties into this input. This is a technique that you should use sort of sparingly, but we're okay with it in this case because we know that title props is only the value and the onChange. So we'll do the same thing here. We'll get rid of the value. We'll get rid of the onChange. And we're okay to use this spread syntax to push in the color props because we know we're not pushing in too many properties. We're just pushing in two. Okay, so we have used our useInput hook, our custom hook. And now what we'll do is we'll try to grab purple. We see that pop up and then we clear it out on OK. So this is pretty exciting. We're able to create a custom hook. Remember, a hook is just a function that we can use for any sort of repeatable code. We want to think about a hook as being very reusable. We can share it across our projects. We can write tests for this function, and then we can use it inside of our form anytime we need to process some user input. So think about all of the different form fields that I might create in my lifetime. They always take something in. We handle a change event. We handle resetting that field when we submit the form. So this is really flexible and reusable across projects and across components. In the previous video, we looked at how to use our custom hook called useInput to process form element inputs and then reset those values. And we can use this hook across any project that uses forms. There also are a ton of different form libraries that you can reach out to as well. So I wanted to just give you a sense of what a few of these are. The first of these is called Formic, which you can find at formic.org. This is a great way of being able to basically handle submitting these forms. We can take in initial values and think about the form holistically as a collection of different fields. There's also a library called React Hook Form, which helps us with creating forms that use validation. Of course, React hooks are in play with this one as well. And there's a lot of cool things in the API for TypeScript and other advanced features that you can use to create some really scalable forms. So I just wanted to point these out to you. I also wanted to pull up another website called usehooks at usehooks.com. This is not form specific, but there are a ton of different resources here, a ton of different hooks that you can think of as being sort of like recipes for creating different types of hooks. There are some really common use cases that you'll see here, and you can open all of them in Code Sandbox to check them out. Formic, React Hook Form, Use Hooks, all are great resources if you want to kind of study what they're doing, or if you want to incorporate some of these tools into your own projects. Another important thing to know how to do with React is how to fetch data from some sort of external API. So the API that I want to grab some data from is the GitHub API, which you can find at api.github.com/users/whatever your user ID is. So you can do this for your company, for yourself, whatever you see fit. You would just drop your username after that last slash there. So this is our GitHub REST API that we can use to grab some live data from this source. And what we'll do here is we want to fetch this data using a combination of useState and useEffect. So we're going to use state to handle the data, and we're going to use useEffect to actually make that call for that external data. So in order to get us started here, let's just make sure that our app is working as we expect it to. We want it to say data here. And once I have this ready, we can go ahead and make this fetch. Now, inside of our app, we're going to create a container for the data, which we'll call data, and the function for updating the data will be called setData. Then we're going to say useState, and our initial state for the data will be null. Then we're going to make use of useEffect, and this is where the exciting part happens, because we're going to use this fetch call, and we're going to fetch from https api.github.com/users/moonhighway. And again, you can use your own username for that. Fetch is built into the browser. It's supported. It's a way of making an HTTP request to get some data from some sort of source. Once we get that data back, we're going to take that response, and we'll call this function called .json. So this is going to take whatever the response is and turn it into JSON. And then finally, we're going to chain on another .then function and say set data. So set data here is the same as saying take this data and call set data with the data. But notice that the same value is being sent to this function that set data is being called with. So we can use a shorthand here and call setData that way. The other thing we want to do to useEffect, of course, is just pass in that empty array, meaning that we should only make a request for this data once when our application first renders. So this is super important, right? We want to make sure we're not making too many API requests. This is something that I've done a million times before, which is to make too many requests to an API. Sometimes I've been blocked by an API because of that, but we know that this should return that data. Now, if we have some data, if data has a value, we're going to return for the moment a pre-tag that, and this is just a pre-formatted tag to format some JSON. And we'll say that we want to stringify data, null, and 2. Data is the data, and null and 2 are going to help format this so that we can actually read it out here in our browser. And notice that if there is some data, we're going to display it. Fetching this data with useEffect has allowed us to perform some sort of a side effect. This is more of a real-world example outside of a console log, of course, like we saw before. In the next video, we're going to make use of this actual data and create a component. Now that we have some data loaded, it is time to actually display our data in a component. So over here, we have our object of data. We have a few different fields that we can make use of, and we want to be able to display this data in a separate component. So I'm going to call this GitHub user. And GitHub user is going to take the data and display it. So we'll go ahead and return a div. Inside of that div, we'll have an h1. And the place we want to actually work with this is here. So we're going to return the GitHub user. And then, of course, we need to pass it a few different properties. So the name property would be data.name. Let's make sure that we can see this. So we'll destructure name, and we should see that there. Pretty cool. So now, of course, I've lost all my data. So let's go ahead and pull that up in a new window. Let's grab the person's location. So we'll say location, data.location. So now we should see this as well. The final thing I want to display is some sort of image. So we have a field here called avatar URL. We'll add an image here. The source will be avatar. So this is data.avatar underscore URL. We also need to pass this here. Nice. Let's make it a little smaller. So we'll say height is 150 pixels. Awesome. And finally, we want to make sure that we have some sort of alt text being displayed. So we can go ahead and grab that from somewhere. We could say alt equals name. And so now this should have an alt attribute. Perfect. So regardless of what data you're displaying, anytime you are making a fetch for some data from some sort of external API like the GitHub API, the first step we need to take is to fetch the data using a useState and useEffect in combination. And then we can use the magic of React to pass properties down to a child component like GitHub user, and then we can pull from the data points that we need so that that data can be displayed. Pretty cool. When we're fetching data from some sort of external API, our data can be in one of a few different states. So let's talk through what those are. First of all, we have a loading state. So a loading state just means we're fetching the data, but it hasn't yet come back. We have a success state where we have some data to display. Then we want to have some sort of an error state if something goes wrong. We can represent all of this with useState hooks. So we have our data here on line 15. Let's also create a value for error and set error. We'll set that equal to useState and initialize with null. Finally, we'll say const loading and set loading. This will be set equal to useState, and our initial state will be false. Okay, so now we need to represent all of these inside of our component. So first things first, we want to scroll down a little bit so that we can, in our useEffect, model the flow of data into our component. So the first thing we'll do is we're going to set loading to true. Then we're going to make our fetch a little bit more robust too. So once the data comes back, we'll set the data with that set data function. And then we're also going to use this to set our loading state back to false because we have the data. It's no longer loading. And then finally, what's cool about these .then chains is that you can chain on a catch. Catch is going to, if there's some sort of an error, set an error. So now what we want to do here is we want to display our GitHub user component if everything goes as expected. So we're going to get rid of if data. We're going to get rid of this return here. And then above this, we're going to say if loading is true, we want to return an H1 that says loading. Also, if there's an error of any kind, then we want to return a pre-formatted JSON string to display that error. So we'll say error, and then we'll say if there's no data, then we'll return null. Perfect. So let's try to refresh this. It's working kind of fast. Our internet is too fast here. But once this loads for the first time, it's going to say loading here at the top. Then we're going to see the rest of the data once it's ready. So any sort of asynchronous request we're making, we need to handle a loading state where we're waiting on that data to come back. We need to handle a success case as well as an error state. So all of this can be represented using these useState hooks. We can also use React to fetch data from a GraphQL API. So let's take a look at the GraphQL API that we're going to fetch from. We're going to make a request to this endpoint, snowtooth.moonhighway.com. So if you haven't worked with GraphQL before, just know that GraphQL is a way of creating an API where you can specify what data you want by using its field. So over here is our query. This tool that we're looking at is called the GraphQL Playground, and you can use it to send requests much like you do with REST. Instead of grabbing our GitHub user, we're going to call this lift. Then with each one of these, we're going to grab its name, elevation gain, and status. So here in the H1, we'll say name, we'll say elevation gain, and then we'll say status. Then we can remove our image here. We're basically just going to create one of these lift components for every one of our lifts in our list. So the place we'll fetch from is this endpoint here, snowtooth.moonhighway.com. There we go. We can keep the rest of the data fetching logic the same. The only thing we would need to change is down here in our return. So if we want to iterate over this data, we're going to need to do this. So we're going to first create a div that we want to render here. Then inside of this div, inside of a JSX expression, we'll say data.allLifts.map. For each one of our lifts that we create, we want to return our lift component. And the lift component needs a little bit of data, right? So we'll say name, elevation gain equals lift.elevation gain. And finally, we'll use status, which is lift.status. Now it's still loading over here. We aren't quite finished because we need to make our fetch request a little bit more robust to send along the body of the query. Right now, we're just saying, hey, give me all the data from this, but I need to pass along the query, which would look like this, to actually get all of this information back. So let's go ahead and copy this query. We're going to paste it into our page here. So we'll say const query equals, and this query should be a string. So we'll use backticks around the query. Then we're going to specify some options. So we'll say const opts. The method that we're going to use to send this request is a post request. We're going to specify some headers. So here we'll say content type application/JSON. And then we'll say body json.stringify the query. So we'll send along that string when we send that request. The final thing we need to do here, now that we have these options, is fetch is going to take in both the URL that we're making the request to and the options. So OPTS. So even though this looks pretty good to me, I'm still not seeing any data coming back. It says loading and then no data is returned. We also see here that there's some sort of an error because it can't read properties of undefined map. So here's a really interesting thing that's going on here. If we console log data, and let's call out that that's where that's happening. If we scroll up a little bit, we should see that data is coming back, but it's underneath another key called data. So let's try that. And there we go. Data. One of those fun little fetch request things that's going on. We have to make sure that we are referencing the correct fields on the data that's coming back. Now that we are, we should see all of this data being displayed. So this is a look at how you might use GraphQL with a fetch request inside of a React application. If you are dealing with a GraphQL data source, you can make use of fetch just as you would with a REST API. The final pattern I want to show you with data loading has to do with how we use functions to display the right data at the right time. So let me show you what I mean by that. We're going to get rid of most of our code here. We're going to make this way shorter. We're also going to get rid of our map here. So let's just make sure that's working. Perfect. So let's also create some data here. So I'm going to create a data set called Tahoe Peaks. It's going to be an array of objects. Each object is going to have its own name and elevation. So 10891. These are real. You can check them out. We'll say Monument Peak. We will set that elevation at 10067. Let's add a couple more of these. Name, pyramid. And of course, if you don't feel like typing these, you can always find these in the finished files for this chapter. No shame in copying and pasting. And then finally, we'll add tilak, elevation 9735. 9735. Perfect. So now that we have the elevation in feet, we're going to create a function called list. So this list function is going to be a function that takes in a few different properties. The first of which is data. The second is a function called render item. The third is a function called render empty. So render item will help us to render an individual list item, and then render empty will be what is displayed if we don't have anything in this list. So let's go ahead and return. We'll say if data.length doesn't exist, so if there's nothing in the data, we want to return the render empty function. Otherwise, we want to return an unordered list where we'll map over the data. So check this out. We'll say data.map. For each item, we will return a list item. Sorry, let's save that so we can actually read it. And then we're going to give each list item a key, which we'll just set to be the item dot name. And then we'll say render item with whatever that item is. Now, it's up to us next to adjust our app so that it's going to pump the data into the list component in the correct way. So we'll get rid of our div. We'll use the app to render the list. List will have a property called data, which we'll set to Tahoe Peaks, our list of peaks. We're also going to add render empty. And render empty is just going to render a paragraph. So we'll say this list is empty. And then finally, we'll say render item. And this is going to be a function. So for each item, we want to return, and check this out, we're going to use a shorthand version of the React fragment. Remember our React fragment from before? We can use this shorthand syntax like we saw. And then inside of this, we'll say item.name and item.elevation. And then we'll say feet. Perfect. So now we are able to see all of this content being displayed. A couple things to think about. We are passing along some JSX to render if the list happens to be empty. So if we got rid of this, the list is empty. Pretty cool. Render item is going to return just this fragment. It'll pass along a little bit of data so that that can be displayed inside of that list item. So our list and our app components will display any data in a list, no matter how long the list is. And there will even be some fallback content in case we need to render an empty list. On any website, it's really important to have some sort of mechanism for moving from page to page. Now with React, we're dealing with different components. So how do I move from component to component when we're dealing with a single page application? The solution for that is to incorporate React Router. React Router will allow for us to seamlessly move from page to page by displaying different components. React Router is at version 6 right now, so we're going to go ahead and install this in our project. So let's make sure that we're in the correct folder. We're going to move to the React app that's in chapter 7, lesson 1 here. And we're going to go ahead and install npm install React Router DOM at 6. We're trying to install specifically version 6. Great. So once you've done that, we're going to make some adjustments here to our app. Let's go ahead and get rid of our peaks for now. We're going to get rid of our list for now. So in our app component, we're going to go ahead and just display app. Let's make sure that this is running with npm start. And then over here on localhost 3000, we should see our app rendering. So we'll get those side by side here. Nice. So let's also create a few different components here. We're going to create a component called home. And the home component is going to return a div that has an h1. And then we'll also create a few different components here for different pages on that website. So we'll say about, very simple website here. We'll say about, and then we'll also create a page for contact. So just kind of mimicking what a simple website nav might look like. Okay. So we could just say, let's render our home component here, and that's going to render my website. But eventually we want to be able to click through to different pages simply by using the router. So now that React Router is installed and we have a few pages in our app skeleton here, in the next video, we're actually going to configure the router so that we can make this navigation happen. The first step in configuring our router is to head over to our index.js file where we're rendering our app. So I'm going to perform a little bit of cleanup here just so that we can focus on the important stuff. We're going to get rid of React strict mode for now. We don't need those extra warnings. We'll also remove report web vitals. We need to import browser router from React Router DOM here. And this is going to be the component that we need to wrap around the app. So how do I give my app and any of the child components underneath that app information about routing and where I am currently? I need to pass it with this browser router. Okay, so we're going to also import routes here and route. So the routes component is going to go inside of the browser router. And then here is where we're going to configure, set up all of our different paths that we want to display. So instead of just using the app here, we're going to say that, hey, at route path equals /. So whenever I'm just visiting localhost 3000, Which element do I want to display? Which component do I want to display? We're going to pass this in via a JSX expression here, app, and then we can remove that from here. We also need to close that, of course. There we go. So now when I visit this page, I should see this here. Next up, let's do this. We'll say route path equals / about. And then the component that I want to display here is going to be about. So what I need to do is import app, but I also need to import our about component. Let's also make sure that we are exporting this correctly. So we'll say export function about. We'll export function contact. We'll export function app. And we'll just leave function home as is. Here we want to remove this default export. So that's going to break our app until we import it correctly. Okay, so now if we visit about, we should see about us over here in the browser. And I just did that by going to, and it's hard to see, /about. So you can create as many of these as you'd like to inside of your route configuration. So we could say route path equals /contact. Here we would need to import this. We'll say contact. We should be importing these all from the same import. You're probably yelling at your screen for me to do that. So let's go ahead and make sure that's closed. And then every time I go to these different routes, I should be able to see that information displayed. Now, we don't want to force our users to type the correct route into the URL bar. So in the next video, we're going to take a closer look at how we can create links to these different pages. Now that we have successfully rendered our few different components at contact, at about, and at the home route, we want to be able to link from these different pages without typing this into the browser. So the first thing I want to do here is import a component from React Router called link. A quick note too, that the reason that we're importing everything from React Router DOM is because we're using the DOM, we're using the browser to create a web application. There are React Router tools for React Native as well. So this is why that's split out into its own package. The next thing we want to do here is inside of our home component, we want to display these different links. So here we'll say link. So the link we want to create here is to our about page. So first we want to display this. Let's go ahead and hit save. Nothing is going to be displayed until I add this to /about. So check it out. Now I can click on about and that will take me over to that link. So let's do the same for contact. And then back to our home route, I should see both of those links here. All right, once I've created that nav, I can also add this to my about us. This might be nice to have here. So we'll say link to equals / and we'll call that home. So let's make sure that we're on this page. We click home and that takes us back. And then finally, let's go ahead and paste that into here. So now on each one of these pages, I should be able to navigate successfully back and forth between these pages. So of course we could style this a little nicer, but this is letting us know that the link is a powerful component that we can use to navigate between our different pages. The next step we want to take here is we want to create a child page for our about component that's going to display some information about our company's history. First things first, we'll create a div. Inside of that div, we'll create an h1, and then we'll say our history. Nice, what a beautiful page. Let's say we wanted to display this as a child of the about page. I want the contents of this to be displayed underneath our about us. There's a couple steps we need to take to make that happen. The first step is we're going to go back to our route configuration and we're going to nest some routes. So let's go ahead and open our index.js file. And then inside of this route, inside of the about route, we're going to close this. And then we're going to put in another route. And this other route is going to display that other component. So we'll start with the element because that's the easier part. We'll say history. We also need to import history from the app file. There we go. And then what we want to do for our path is we'll just say path equals history. And we'll omit the slash from that. When I click on about, and then when I visit about/history, we're still not seeing that content there. So the step I need to take is I need to open our app.js once more. We're going to import another component from React Router DOM called outlet. So you want to think about outlet as being like a little container that's going to display our history component. So here on line 25, we're going to say outlet. So our history is going to pop up right here. So we're displaying this component as soon as I'm on the page about/history. If I remove /history, we'll just see about us. And then if I wanted to, I could link to this as well. A nested route configuration is really a powerful thing because we can then create all sorts of page hierarchies within our application. It's just important to know that at some level, we want to have our route configuration created. We define all of the paths, and then we create the element property to display the correct component at the correct time. So far, we keep using npm start to run our application on localhost 3000. But there's a pretty cool built-in feature that is part of Create React App where we can run npm test to run all of our tests. So anytime I type npm test, we're going to run any of the tests that are currently in the app. So here in our terminal, we should be able to see that one of these tests has failed. So the test that we're actually seeing run is here in this app.test.js file. And what this is saying is that we expect our screen to say learn React. Just know that npm test will run anything with that .test.js extension. So right now, this is telling us that our test suite failed to run because our test suite must contain at least one test. So Create React App gives us this mechanism for dealing with running tests. In the next video, we're going to take a look at how we actually write these and connect them to functions that are part of our app. We can start to think about testing with a small example here. So inside of our source folder, we want to create two different files. The first is called functions.js. And the second will be called functions.test.js. So we want to think about our functions file as being the place where our code will be written, and then our npm test command is going to run any tests that are part of this file. Create React App already has Jest configured, so all we need to do is start writing tests. So we're going to write a test using the test function. And then the test function is going to have a name as its first argument. So we're going to keep it real simple here. We'll just say multiplies by 2. And then it's also going to take in this callback function. So this callback function is going to have another function inside of it called expect. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is let's open up our functions.js file. We'll open this to the side here. So they're side by side. Export default a function called times2. And this function is going to just be stubbed for now. And then within our functions test, we need to import this. So we'll say import times2 from /functions. And then here's where we start to write our test. We want to here call the times2 function, and we want to pass in 4. So even if we haven't written our function yet, we know that if I call the times2 function with the value 4, I expect the output to be whatever 4 times 2 is. So we're going to chain on this function called to_be, and we're going to pass 8 here. So we expect anytime I call this function that if given this value, we want to return this value. Let's try to run npm test. So npm test should run our tests, any files that have test in it. At this moment, we should have some sort of an error because it says that times2 is not a function because we haven't written it yet. So let's go ahead and fix this. We're going to, within our functions.js file, take in some sort of argument, and then we'll say return a times 2. Now, if we save this, we're seeing times2 is not a function again, and that's because I've imported it wrong. So what we can do to fix this is you either get rid of default, and then we should see that passing, or you can keep default and then just import this as the module instead of as the function. What's great about this is that by going through the process of testing, we're seeing, hey, some of our code is problematic. We're exporting things incorrectly, and testing will let us know what the problem is. So just to recap, Jest is built in to create React app. We're using the expect function to figure out what the value of times2 is if we call it with for. We're chaining on this matcher here, this Jest matcher. Now, something to keep in mind is that if you take a look at the Jest documentation, there are a ton of different matchers that you can make use of. To be is going to just match for exact equality, but there are others you could check for values being truthy, falsy, null. You can check for numbers. You can match strings and all sorts of different things. So if you want to take a look at this documentation, you don't have to memorize all of this. Thankfully, all of this is well documented on this page. Another test utility that's built directly into Create React App is React Testing Library. So let's take a closer look at how we might use this in our own project. And to do so, we're going to start by creating a new component called star. And then we'll also create a file called star.test.js. And remember that Jest is going to run any of these test files if they end in that .test.js extension. So in the star.js file, we're going to export our function. And our star is going to display the following. We'll just say cool star. So now that I've created that, we're going to open up our star test.js. Having things side by side is nice. And we're going to use a function called test to say renders an h1. So remember, we're not actually rendering this to the DOM anywhere. This is a brand new component that we haven't actually rendered. It's important to know that it doesn't matter. We can use these test utilities to actually render this for us. So this is what this will look like. We're going to first import a function called render from @testing library/React. So let's zoom out a little bit. We will make sure we see all this stuff. And now inside of our test, inside of the callback function here, we're going to say const. So we'll destructure from the render of star what's called a React testing library query. So think of a query as being a way of selecting a particular element based on some sort of a property. So in this case, we're going to say get by text, which is going to, if we create another variable here, so we'll call get by text. So this is going to look for some text that says cool star. So here we'll say expect the h1. So we expect this value to have text content cool star. So we're selecting it, and then we expect it to have that text. So let's go ahead and run this with npm test. This is going to look for that file. And then this is also letting us know that we need to import it. So we're getting helped out all the time with testing. So let's go ahead and import this from star. And then we should see that this has passed. Just a note too that anytime we want to rerun our tests, we can hit A in the terminal, and that will rerun all the tests. We've been able to render our component without actually having to render it and look at it. We're automating the process of making sure that the right content is in the right place. Another important part of writing tests is testing events that are part of components. So we're going to go ahead and create a component called checkbox.js, and then checkbox.test.js will house our tests. So back to our checkbox, we remember this one from before. We're going to import useReducer from React. Then we're going to export a function called checkbox. In it, we're going to have a return here. So we'll say that this fragment should contain a label that reads either checked or unchecked based on the property that we initialize here. So we'll say checked and set checked should be set equal to useReducer. useReducer takes in two arguments. The first is a function that should be called anytime we invoke set checked. So we should return whatever the opposite of checked is. And then we also want to initialize our state as false whenever this component renders. So we have the label, that's cool. We want to also add our input with the type of checkbox, a value of checked, and an on change that will set to set checked. So now we have our little checkbox component created. So from here, we want to start to write some tests. Back to our checkbox test.js, we'll go ahead and we'll use our test function from React testing library. We're going to give our test a name. So we'll say selecting the checkbox should change value of checked to true. And then the callback function that we'll send in here should contain our tests. So let's shorten this up a little bit. Selecting checkbox should change value to true. Okay, that's better. We can actually read that. So now we're going to use another one of these queries. So we'll say get by label text. And we want that to be set equal to render our checkbox. So we need a couple of things, right? We need to import render from @testing-library/React. We also need to import our checkbox from that file. So get by label text is going to look for whatever we set up in this next value. So we'll say get by label text, and we expect this to say not checked. And we want to look for any text that says not checked. Now, currently this regex that we're adding here, this regular expression, is going to look for case sensitivity. So if you wanted to be a little more permissive, you could add an I here. And that's just going to make sure that it reads not checked, but it could be all caps, it could be the N capitalized, whatever. Here's the exciting part. We knew we were going to get to an exciting part. What we want to do here is we want to automate the process of firing an event on this checkbox. In other words, we want to be able to click on this checkbox. The way we'll do that is by calling fire event. Fire event is a function that will pull in from React testing library. So fire event.click, whenever we click on that checkbox, we expect checkbox.checked to equal true. Let's try to run this. And we'll run it in a way that we can read it. npm test should run all of our existing tests. Okay, so we're getting this error here, and it's saying that we found a label with text of, and basically this is just an error saying that we need to associate this label with the input. One way that we could do this is we could wrap the label around the input, or you can just say HTML4 checked, and then on the input you can add an ID of checked. So this should associate the two with one another. This is good semantic form approaches, and then this should pass the test. So a couple things here. Number one, inside of our test.js file, we have triggered an event change by calling fire event. And then we're using this nice combination of React testing library where we have all of these queries with the expect that we have built in with Jest. Lots of cool features are built directly into Create React App, and I encourage you to play around more with the testing library documentation to learn about all of the different features that you can make use of. One of the tools that you can use to deploy your React application is netlify. So let's go ahead and log in. You can log in with your GitHub account, GitLab, Bitbucket. You can create your own account with your email address. I'm just going to go ahead and log in with GitHub here. And since I'm logged in, it should pop me into this window, and I'm going to click on Add New Site. So one of the options here is import an existing project. You could connect to your Git provider if you've already uploaded your project here. That's kind of a quick way of getting started. But since we don't have GitHub set up for this particular project, I'm going to select Deploy Manually. What netlify is looking for in this drag and drop window is the built version of our project. So let me show you how to do that. We're going to make sure that we're navigated to the finished React app location, and we're going to run npm run build. This is going to create a production build for our application, meaning that this will be optimized for production. It will have everything ready to go. This will generate what's called the build folder here. So what I can do inside of React App Finished is I can drag the build folder to this location. So this will create a nice little URL for me. It's also going to build my project. So if I open this up in a new tab, check it out, we see our awesome website. So netlify is a free tool that you can use to deploy a React application quickly, and they make it kind of fun to work with because we can just drag and drop our project and then we're ready to go right away. Now from here, you can customize all sorts of things. You could set up a custom domain, you could set up HTTPS support, but for now we should see our project running, and it's running at this link. Now that you've made it through this course, you have a really solid foundation for starting to work on React projects. If you want to take the next steps, or if you ever get stuck, there are a few resources that you can use. So first of all is the React documentation. In my opinion, the React docs are some of the best docs out there. So you can always look there for more advice, or you can click on community and find a ton of different meetups and courses and conferences for taking the next steps. Now that you understand React, you can also start to build your own native applications using React Native. So I definitely encourage you to check that out. Finally, if you're interested in data loading or how you can predictably load data into your React applications, I'd encourage you to check out GraphQL. GraphQL is something that I found super useful in my work. I'm so glad that you joined me for this class, and I'm really excited to see what you'll build with React.